Uhuru, brothers and sisters, comrades. This is Omali, chairman of the African People's Socialist Party and leader of the Uhuru movement and the International African Revolution. On today, we are looking at people in various places around the world, and certainly in the United States, Africans who are celebrating Black History Month. So it's called. In fact, it is something that occurs in the United States. It occurs in England and a few other places, in Canada and the Netherlands even. But what is in England, it occurs in October. And this Black History Month, that sometimes is called African American History Month or African History Month. It is something that was brought about by the efforts of Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson was an African educator who had educated in various places of the world, but who was based in the United States. And Woodson had serious problems with the education of African people. And he made various struggles and efforts to change that, to take that on. And he had some pretty sharp opinions that I think is really important, be helpful for us to know. Because right now we are talking about liberating our history and liberating ourselves. And we're using this occasion, this African American History or African History Month or Black History Month, as is characterized in some quarters, to have this discussion about liberating our history and liberating ourselves, and how the issue of history, African history and African liberation go together. Woodson had serious problems. He wrote a book in 1933 called The Miseducation of the Negro. And in 1926, he was responsible with an association that he was a part of around Negro history, as it was called. And he was really concerned about the kind of education African people were getting. This is why he wanted to raise this issue of history for Black people, for African people. He was really disappointed by the kind of education African people were getting. And so in this book, Miseducation of the Negro, he makes some really interesting points. And he had serious problems with the sectors of the African petty bourgeoisie, middle class, educated Negroes, as well as the colonizers, the white people who control us. And he wrote in this book, in the preface of this book, that the same education process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought that he is everything and has accomplished everything worthwhile, depresses and crushes at the same time the spark of genius in the Negro by making him feel that his race does not amount to much and never will measure up to the standards of other peoples. The Negro thus educated is a hopeless liability of the race. The difficulty is that the educated Negro is compelled to live and move among his own people whom he has been taught to despise. As a rule, therefore, the educated Negro prefers to buy his food from a white grocer because he's been taught that the Negro is not clean. It does not matter how often the Negro washes his hands then, he cannot clean them. And it does not matter how often a white man uses his hands, he cannot soil them. The educated Negro, moreover, is disinclined to take part in Negro business because he has been taught in economics that Negroes cannot operate in this particular sphere. The educated Negro gets less and less pleasure out of the Negro church, not because of his primitiveness and increasing corruption, but because of his preference for the seats of righteousness controlled by his oppressor. This has been his education, and nothing else can be expected of him. If the educated Negro could go off and be white, he might be happy, but only a mulatto now and then can do this. The large majority of this class then must go through life denouncing white people because they are trying to run away from the blacks, and declaring the blacks because and decrying the blacks because they are not white. The educated Negroes have the attitude of contempt toward their own people, because in their own, as well as in their mixed schools, Negroes are taught to admire the Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, and the Teuton, and to despise the African. Of the hundreds of Negro high schools recently examined by an expert in the United States Bureau of Education, only 18 offers a course taking up the history of the Negro. And in most of the Negro colleges and universities where the Negro is thought of, the race is studied only as a problem or dismissed as of little consequence. So this is Carter G. Woodson, and this is the understanding that compelled him to push for the Negro history. First, it was the Negro History Week. That was the second weekend in February. And as I mentioned earlier, it has become known as Black History Month, or Black African American History Month, or African History Month. But this is how it began. And again, Carter G. Woodson was the person who really pushed and promoted that, and is responsible more than any other person for something recognized as significant about the history of African people in this country. But I want to talk some about that, and at the risk of inspiring a tremendous amount of boredom, I'm going to say I'm going to delve just a little bit in some theoretical aspects of this question. But even before we look at that, we can anticipate much of what's going to be put forward in the United States in particular, and perhaps this is true of other places as well, that's engaged in this celebration of what's characterized as Black history or African American history, however it is characterized. We know that we're going to hear a lot about George Washington Carver, who it is claimed made peanut butter. Carter was a very brilliant man. He was an extraordinary person. He was a painter. He was a musician. He was a scientist par excellence. And it's really interesting because when he was at Tuskegee, where he had his laboratory, Tuskegee Institute, the Rockefellers would come down on a regular basis and take stuff that he had created, inventions that he had created, discoveries that he had made it, and for their own. And I'm sure they must have given some kind of pittance to Tuskegee Institute, but Carver was a very brilliant man. And so, they'll tell us about George Washington Carver. They'll tell us that Carver is the guy who invented peanut butter and some 20 some odd other products from the peanut. Of course, the peanut is something that comes from Africa in the sense that we've done extraordinary things historically with the peanut, and you will find some variation of peanut butter in various dishes on the African continent. So I suspect that much of this invention in this instance around the peanut may have simply survived in the memory of African people and the family of George Washington Carver. So they tell us that George Washington Carver did this. They won't talk at all about the fact that Carver invented peanut butter, yet Peter Pan and some other brand, corporate bourgeois colonial corporate brand owns it all, that it didn't benefit Africans at all in terms of economic development or ownership. It's still owned by the white people, the white man, and we'll get to that, moving forward. And the other thing they don't talk about when they mention George Washington Carver, which probably reveals more about history, United States history, and history of the colonizers, all of the European colonizers against African people, is that George Washington Carver was born in captivity. He was born as someone who was enslaved and formerly owned by a white man named Carver. And they don't mention the fact that because Carver did participate in providing Washington as a child some form of education and had him around the house a lot, partially as a companion for his daughter, they castrated George Washington Carver. Most you haven't heard that, have you? And that's not something that's commonly spoken of when they talk about George Washington Carver. There's a segment of the population in the US who like to say that Carver was bisexual. They don't say Carver was castrated, that the white man, the colonizer who owned him, had him castrated so that he would not be someone who might soil his white daughter, that his white daughter might not become a conquest of sexual conquest of George Washington Carver. But that's a part of the history that they don't mention, in part because peanut butter, you can deal with peanut butter, especially since it's owned by the colonial corporations and not by African people ourselves. So that's what you'll hear maybe about George Washington Carver. You may hear some things about slavery. Of course, they have to talk about slavery, but they talk about it just about slavery as this incident in US history and as evidence of the progress we've made from that time when we were quote unquote enslaved. In fact, you can go to some great museums that they've created inside the United States, and they will even tell you about the horrors of slavery. This is history as they present. They'll tell you about the horrors of slavery, and they'll give you examples of that, and they'll tell you about the horrors of Jim Crow and of segregation and things like that. And then, of course, what they do with their version of history is show you how the African has sort of become emancipated, how the African now has made so much progress and has the consequence of an Oprah Winfrey and Barack Hussein Obama. And now, of course, they would add Kamala Harris to that. So for them, they will show you something that purports to be history, that shows bad things happening to us, with a history that began on a cotton plantation and a cotton patch. And then evidence of how much progress we've made is the fact that we're no longer on the cotton patch, unless we're in prison, of course, which is quite possible, especially if you're in Angola or Parchment in Mississippi or Rayford or in Florida or some other place like that. So they tell history in a way that most often starts on a cotton plantation and then subsequently shows that the progress we've made because there has been a Negro president, a Negro vice president today, something to that effect, and a lot of Negroes who occupy spaces in the US governmental system. You get that kind of history. That's what they'll call history. But history truly is more than just a series of incidents. It's not even just the question of the fact that human civilization and history, therefore itself, has its origin in Africa. It does. It does. I mean, you will not find any evidence of civilizations going back further in time than what you will find with Africa. You'll find magnificent monuments that examples that were left behind in Africa. You can go to any museum, in any major museum in any European controlled country, and you will find looted objects, even bodies that's been dug up from Africa. And most often this is going to be Egypt. So this is the origin. This is where history itself began. This is where human civilization began. That is to say, Africa is where it happened. And so they might even show you some evidence of this, but they will obscure the significance of that. And I'm not saying that's bad. I think in some ways that's extremely good for you, for us to know what we have accomplished, because that's one of the things that's important about history. History is sort of like the memory of a people, a memory of a society. And if you don't have that, then you are subject to having someone else's memories implanted in your brain, and as a substitute for your own memory, as a substitute for your own brain. This is what has happened to us. This is what Carter G. Woodson was complaining about in the part that I read from the preface of his the Miseducation of the Negro that he wrote in 1933. So, but it's important for us to know those things about our history. It's important to know that human civilization began in Africa itself, that human life is originated in Africa. It's important to know many of the accomplishments that we've made in history throughout the generations, throughout history altogether, because once someone takes away your history, takes away your memory, then as I suggested, they will give you the memory they want you to have. They will wipe your brains clean. It's like a form of a lobotomy, where they a brain operation that can make you forget who you are, where you came from, and then have another memory implanted in your brain. And this is what has happened to us when they can do that. Because the thing about knowing what we have accomplished, knowing our history, is evidence of what we are capable of doing. And if someone can convince us that we had no history before the white man, that we had no history before the colonizer, then he can rely on having a people completely dependent and seeing everything that happens to it as being progress. For example, this whole notion that we get in the United States, and we get this in Africa too in a different form, that somehow slavery rescued us from savagery, and that what happened with us is that being enslaved in the United States was beneficial to us, and that Africans have been terrified consequently of running from slavery because our memory has been erased. And we have been told that without the white man, without the slave master, then we are helpless, hopeless, there's nothing we can do. When the truth of the matter is, it's been the Africans who fed the slave master, the colonizers. It's been the Africans who built the housing for the colonizers. It's been the African who's cleaned his streets and who's nursed his babies and who's done all these other kinds of things. Yet, somehow, because we do not have access to our own memory, our own history, then we can be convinced that it is we who are dependent and not this slimy animal who would presuppose the right and the righteousness of owning other human beings. So, and to that extent, it's really important for us to have some access to our history and to our accomplishments as a people. But in the final analysis, the real deal that we're confronted with is the need to recognize what someone said about freedom. And it is that freedom is the recognition of necessity. Freedom is the recognition of necessity. And in order to be free, one must recognize necessity or have access to a recognition of necessity. And part of what that means is, what is necessity? What is necessary? And we say that the primary force, the driving force in all human society is the production and reproduction of human life itself. That's necessary. If you don't have that, you don't have anything. You don't have any culture, you don't have any religion, you don't have any of the things that have been attributed to human development. You don't have religion. I know there are people who may have issues with saying that the driving, the motive force in society, in all human society, is the production and reproduction of life. And because without life, you have nothing else. So that's necessity. And what we're saying too is that when you look at the issue of history, history is a product of human beings involved in the production and reproduction of life. That's where history is made. That's how history is made, where human beings engage with nature to transform nature so that it serves our interests as human beings. That's one of the distinguishing features of being human. And this is what we do naturally and normally. This is where culture comes from as well. Culture and what we call history is a product of our engage in the process to create life. So this is something that I want to share with you that comes from the political report that I made to our sixth Congress in 2018. And it's really important for us to understand in terms of liberating our history and liberating ourselves. We say that our party and movement were forced to conclude that all humans, including Europeans, were trapped by an absolute necessity to secure and develop the means of subsistence. In other words, the primary motivating factor in human society is the production and reproduction of life. Without life, all other questions, religion, culture, genetics, etc., are moot, meaningless. Indeed, culture is a byproduct of the process of producing and reproducing life. However, the process of Africans producing and reproducing life was drastically disrupted and altered by the European attack that resulted in the capture and colonial enslavement of Africa and Africans. This attack by Europeans on Africa also resulted in the imposition of artificial borders that separate the dispersed African nation from our human and material resources and from a meaningful relationship among ourselves and with the peoples of the world. The material and human resources of Africa had gone to satisfy the requirements of life for Europeans at the expense of Africa and Africans. The process of Africans producing and reproducing life has not been primarily for Africa and Africans. It has been primarily for Europe and the white world at our expense. This progenitor of world capitalism, the attack on Africa and Africans, along with the European assault on Asia and the Americas, rescued Europe and Europeans from an oppressive 1,000-year-long disease-ridden, impoverished existence known as feudalism. This was the genesis of the capitalist system as a world economy, created on a base of the enslavement of Africans and others. A scientific analysis of human society requires that we take a dialectical approach. We cannot see the world as static and ready-made. Society has to be analyzed as a process that is in a constant state of motion, change, and development. There is always something new arising to replace the old, and all social motion occurs in relationship to this process of coming into existence and dying away. We're talking about history. Europe's attack on Africa was effectively an assault on Africa's ability to produce life for itself. This assault has had the effect of pushing Africa and Africans out of history. History being the summation of the ongoing struggle to produce and reproduce life. Slavery, genocide, and colonialism are the stuff of which capitalism was born. African enslavement was the first capital in the development of capitalism. The prevailing legal system, culture, religion, and general philosophical outlook or worldview constitute the superstructure of capitalism thus conceived, as well as the version of history constitutes this superstructure. This superstructure is a natural product and reflection of this economic base of colonial slavery. Slavery and colonialism gave rise not only to capitalism, but also to the capitalist and working class alike of Europe and North America. The workers and the bourgeoisie, the two primary capitalist defining classes, have occasionally fought great battles with each other since their inception as contending social forces. Nevertheless, both were born and developed on a platform of slavery and colonialism. Consequently, what is often called class struggle inside the US and Europe is actually contention among the workers and the ruling class for control of the parasitic capitalist pedestal and its stolen resources. The parasitic foundation of world capitalism continues to exist up to now as the true economic base upon which the entire superstructure of the capitalist-defined, capitalist-dominated world rests. The total existence of white people and their ability to produce and reproduce life is dependent on this parasitic relationship that came into being with the attack by feudal Europe on Africa and the world. Instead of separate, more or less self-contained worlds existing in casual relationship to each other, there's one capitalist world system united by a parasitic economic relationship imposed by Europe on the rest of us. There is therefore no European reality or history separate from that of Africa and the rest of the world. The entire world is now locked into a single dialectical process, a unity of opposites, whereupon the gruesome extraction of life and resources from Africa and the rest of the world is a condition for the life and development of what we now know as Europe, white people, and the capitalist system to which we have been forcibly affixed. The legal system, culture, white sense of sameness, and political institutions are reflections of this parasitic economic base. Every white aspiration and dream, every expectation for happiness and a good life, from a successful marriage to a secure future for their children, requires drone strikes in Pakistan, police murders and mass imprisonment in the African colonies and barrios of the US, and starvation and forced displacement of the oppressed throughout the world, and castration. Our theory, practical struggle, and prepared the party to lead, while not appreciative of this parasitic foundation of the entire capitalist system, resting on the oppression of others, of Africans and others. Karl Marx recognized this relationship between the economic foundation of society and the resultant institution and ideas of society. So the point is that African people, like all human beings, have to be engaged naturally as the society in the production and reproduction of life. But Africans, since our captivity and colonial enslavement, not just in the United States, but throughout Africa, the whole continent of Africa itself, and all those other places to which we have been forcibly dispersed at gunpoint throughout the Americas, all of this took us out of the process of producing and reproducing life for ourselves, but we continue to produce and reproduce life for what? For the colonizer. So the colonizer benefits from this. That's why our life spans are shorter. That's why, and even the thinking process that Carter G. Woodson was struggling about is a consequence of this relationship, this superstructure, this ideas, the ideology, the culture, and the political system resting upon this foundation of the economic base of colonial slavery. This is the objective reality that we're confronted with. So what we are talking about is that colonial slavery took Africans out of history, took us out of making history for ourselves as a people, and we made history for the colonizers. We produced and reproduced life for the colonizers. Hence, the great disparity in the length, the lifespan of the colonizer versus ourselves and our children, our family, our people, etc. This is the consequence of this colonial relationship that we have. So it's always sucking resources and the brains and culture and other things from those of us who are colonized. And this is where the question of history really becomes important, because Africans have to fight our way back into history, and we are doing that. And the process of recapturing our history is recapturing our capacity to produce and reproduce life for ourselves. And this is referred to often as freeing up the productive forces of the African nation. And the productive forces of the African nation, of course, is the land. That's one aspect of it, and the human beings who are a critical part of the forces of production, the production forces, and the instruments necessary to make that happen. That's how you go back into history. And then the most important tool of the colonized to re-enter history is revolution. It's the revolutionary movement that negates the authority, the viability of colonialism, that takes life from us in order to have life for the colonizer. And so the way that we really take on the struggle, the way that we begin the process of creation and recreation of life itself, the way that that we take on this critical question of being able to capture the productive forces, the forces of production, is through revolution. And of course, the African People's Socialist Party has been doing this. This is why it's so troubling for so many of the oppressors. This is the kind of work that made Marcus Garvey such a threat to white power, why they had to move on him, because he was creating all these economic entities that gave power over our lives and our ability to produce and reproduce life for ourselves. And if we're producing life and reproducing life for ourselves, who the hell is going to produce and reproduce life for the colonizer? And so this is what made him such a threat. And you appreciated Garvey. That's why he had such a magnificent movement. That's why there was something like 11 million Africans from around the world who participated. That was making history. That's why we had such an appreciation with the original Nation of Islam, with Do for Self, because they gave some evidence of these economic institutions that they were creating. This is part of negating the influence and authority of the colonizers. This is the process of re-entering history by producing and reproducing life for ourselves. That's why so many of you support the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement, because you see the same kind of thing happening within the United States. The various institutions that we've created, more than 50 in the United States alone, that we're in the process now of opening up factories in South Africa and other places. That's to negate the influence and authority of white power, of the colonizer, and that's the re-entry of history. That's African people re-entering, capturing, recapturing our own history. That's what revolution, if you're colonized, that's what it has to do. And if you have some kind of leader that's not engaged in that kind of struggle, that's no leader. That's somebody who's facilitating the ongoing relationship that we have with the colonizer that sucks our blood, sucks our resources, sucks our lives, and take away everything that we have. You should go to apspuhuru.org. Go to apspuhuru.org so that you can learn more about the programs that we have been developing to recapture, to re-enter history as a people. And so that we're not just celebrating some notion of peanut butter, and we're not celebrating about who made the first ability for oil changes on railroad cars or street lights or stuff like that, which don't contribute at all to the production and reproduction of real life for African people. If it doesn't do that, it has no value for us. And so that's what we engaged in. That's what the revolution has to do. That's what the struggle against colonialism has to do. That's what you have to participate in so that you can really begin the process of making history for Africa, for African people. That's why I'm telling you to go to apspuhuru.org. And when you do that, get prepared to come to our plenary process that starts on February 6th and goes through the 9th. You should do that. In that, join this revolutionary project to re-enter history on the terms of African people, as opposed to continuing to make history for our oppressors. apspuhuru.org. Uhuru.